January 31st, 2025, 6:27 p.m. A man took his final breath in South Carolina. His name was Marion Bowman Jr., and he had just become the first person executed in America that year. But this story doesn't start here. It starts 24 years earlier, on a cold February night when everything changed. Marion always said he was innocent. Right until the very end, he never stopped saying it. The question that haunted everyone was simple. Was he telling the truth? If you want to know how this mystery unfolds, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about cases like this. Your support keeps us bringing you these deep dives into real stories. Let's go back to where it all began. February 16th, 2001. Rock Hill, South Carolina. A young woman named Kandee Martin was 21 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. But that night, she disappeared. When her family couldn't reach her, they knew something was terribly wrong. Kandee wasn't the type to just vanish without telling anyone. The next day, police found something that made their hearts sink. A car, burned, destroyed by fire on the side of a road. When they looked inside, they found Kandee's body in the trunk. She had been shot twice. Someone had killed her, put her in the trunk of her own car, and set it on fire. The investigation started immediately. Who would do this? Why? Police needed answers fast. They talked to everyone who knew Kandee. They asked questions all over Rock Hill. Then they heard a name that kept coming up. Marion Bowman Jr., but Marion wasn't easy to find. He had left town. Police wondered why he disappeared so quickly after Kandee's death. Was he running from something? When they finally tracked him down, Marion said he had nothing to do with it. He swore he didn't hurt Kandee. But the police had someone else to talk to. Someone who would tell a very different story. His name was James Gatson, and he was Marion's own cousin. James told police that Marion had confessed to him. He said Marion admitted to shooting Kandee and burning the car. James had details. He knew things about that night. The police listened carefully. They believed him. But here's where things get interesting. James was in trouble with the law too. He was facing his own criminal charges. And when he agreed to testify against Marion, suddenly his charges were reduced. He got a deal. Was James telling the truth? Or was he lying to save himself? May 2002. Just over a year after Kandee's death, Marion Bowman Jr. sat in a courtroom, facing a jury. His life was in their hands. The prosecution brought witness after witness. Many of them were people who had also gotten deals with the law. They said Marion was involved. They said he was guilty. Marion's lawyer was a man named Norbert Cummings. Years later, something would come out about Cummings that would shock everyone. But we'll get to that. The prosecution's case relied heavily on James Gatson's testimony. The cousin, the man with the deal. He told the jury everything he claimed Marion had told him. The jury watched. They listened. They had to decide. Was this cousin telling the truth? Marion's defense tried to fight back. They said the witnesses couldn't be trusted. They said these people were lying to get lighter sentences for their own crimes. But the jury had to choose who to believe. After hearing all the evidence, the 12 people in that jury box made their decision. Guilty. Marion Bowman Jr. was convicted of murder. And in South Carolina, murder could mean the death penalty. The judge sentenced Marion to die by lethal injection. Marion was 40 years old when he entered death row. He would spend the next 23 years there, always saying the same thing. I didn't do it. 23 years is a long time. Think about it. That's longer than some people's entire lives. Marion lived in a tiny cell, knowing that one day, the state planned to end his life. But something interesting happened during those years. Marion started writing. He wrote poetry. He put his feelings on paper. His words showed a side of him that the courtroom never saw. He wrote one poem called, "While I Breathe, I Hope." Those words came from South Carolina's state motto. It was about holding on to hope even when everything seemed hopeless. Before we continue with what happened next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the rest of this story. And comment below, do you think 23 years on death row is justice? Or is it its own form of punishment? During those 23 years, Marion watched as South Carolina stopped executing people altogether. For 13 years, from 2011 to 2024, the state didn't execute anyone. There were legal battles over execution methods. There were debates about whether the death penalty should exist at all. Marion probably wondered if he would ever actually be executed. Maybe the state would change its mind. Maybe new evidence would come forward. Maybe someone would finally believe him. But in September 2024, something changed. South Carolina executed someone for the first time in 13 years. Then they executed another person in November. The state was back in the execution business. And Marion's name was next on the list. As 2024 turned into 2025, Marion knew his time was running out. He was 63 years old now. He had spent more than half his life in prison for a crime he said he didn't commit. January 31st, 2025 was marked on the calendar. That would be the day. But Marion still had something to say. Something that would make people question everything about his case. The mystery was far from over. Remember Norbert Cummings? The lawyer who defended Marion at his trial back in 2002? Well, something came out about him that changed everything people thought they knew about Marion's case. Years after the trial, Cummings did something that shocked the legal world. He joined a white supremacist group. This wasn't just any group. They believed in keeping races separate. They had extreme views about black people. Now think about this. Norbert Cummings was a black man defending another black man accused of killing a black woman. And later, he joined a group that promoted racism. How does that make sense? Marion's legal team discovered this and brought it up in court. They argued that Cummings might not have defended Marion properly because of his own racial bias. Maybe he didn't fight as hard as he should have. Maybe he didn't care enough about saving a black man's life. The courts listened to this argument. But in the end, they said it didn't matter enough to give Marion a new trial. The conviction stood. The death sentence remained. But it made people wonder, what if Marion had a different lawyer? Someone who truly fought for him? Would things have turned out differently? Let's talk more about those witnesses who testified against Marion. Because their stories had problems too. James Gadsden, the cousin, wasn't the only witness who got a deal. Several people who testified against Marion were facing criminal charges of their own. When they agreed to testify, their charges were reduced or dropped completely. Think about that for a moment. If you were facing years in prison and the police said, "Tell us what we want to hear and we'll let you go with less time," would you be tempted to lie? Would you say whatever they wanted, even if it wasn't true? Marion's supporters said this was exactly what happened. They believed these witnesses made up stories or exaggerated the truth to save themselves. But the courts had already decided. The jury had already believed them. There was also talk about evidence that might have been hidden, evidence that could have helped Marion's case. His legal team said prosecutors didn't share everything they should have. In court cases, both sides are supposed to share their evidence. It's called discovery. But sometimes, important information gets buried. What evidence was hidden? Could it have proven Marion was innocent? We may never know for sure. As January 2025 approached, Marion knew what was coming. He could have asked the governor for mercy. In South Carolina, the governor has the power to stop an execution or reduce a death sentence to life in prison. It's called clemency. But Marion made an interesting choice. He decided not to ask for clemency. Why would someone facing death not ask to be spared? Maybe he was tired. Tired of hoping. Tired of fighting. 23 years is a long time to wait for death. Some people said death row itself was a form of torture. Imagine waking up every single day knowing that eventually, the state plans to kill you. But you don't know exactly when. You just wait. And wait. And wait. Or maybe Marion didn't ask for clemency because he refused to beg for his life when he believed he was innocent. Asking for clemency might feel like admitting guilt. Like saying, "Yes, I did it, but please let me live anyway." Marion never admitted guilt. Not once in 23 years. Governor Henry McMaster didn't hear any clemency request from Marion. So he didn't have to make that difficult decision. The execution would proceed as scheduled. Here's where things get even more concerning. South Carolina uses a drug called pentobarbital for lethal injections. It's supposed to put the person to sleep peacefully before stopping their heart. But in November 2024, just 2 months before Marion's execution, something went wrong. A man named Richard Moore was being executed. The first dose of pentobarbital didn't work. They had to give him a second dose. This had never happened before in South Carolina. Why didn't it work the first time? Nobody knew for sure. Maybe there was a problem with the drug. Maybe it was old. Maybe it wasn't stored properly. Or maybe there was a problem with how it was given. This made Marion's supporters very worried. What if the same thing happened to Marion? What if he suffered? There was another concern. Marion weighed 389 pounds. Finding a vein for the four would be harder because of his size. What if they couldn't find a good vein? What if they had to stick him multiple times? What if the drug didn't work properly because of his weight? If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us what you think should happen in cases where there are doubts about guilt. Your engagement helps us continue investigating stories like this. These weren't just small worries. Executions are supposed to be carried out without unnecessary suffering. The Constitution protects people from cruel and unusual punishment. But what counts as cruel? Where's the line? Marion's legal team brought these concerns to court. They filed emergency motions. They asked judges to stop the execution until these problems could be fixed. But time was running out. January 2025 arrived. Marion had just days left to live. He spent his final days doing simple things. Writing more poetry, thinking about his life, preparing mentally for what was coming. He chose his last meal: fried seafood, chicken, onion rings, and desserts. Foods that brought him comfort. He also prepared a final statement. These were the last words he wanted the world to hear. But there was a twist. Marion decided he wouldn't read the statement himself. Instead, he asked his attorney, Boyd Young, to read it for him. Why? Was he too emotional? Too weak? Or did he want his lawyer's voice to be the last one people heard, making his case one final time? The statement was ready. The meal was ordered. The execution chamber was prepared. The witnesses were notified. Everything was set for January 31st at 6 p.m. Across South Carolina, people had different reactions. Some believed justice was finally being served after 24 years. Kandee Martin's family had waited so long for this moment. They wanted closure. They wanted Marion to pay for what he did to Kandee. But others weren't so sure. They saw too many problems with the case. The witnesses who got deals. The racist lawyer. The hidden evidence. The questionable drug. The 23 years of waiting. They wondered if South Carolina was about to execute an innocent man. Protesters gathered outside the prison. Some held signs saying, "Stop the execution." Others held signs with Kandee's picture, demanding justice for her. Inside Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, Marion prepared for his final hours. Soon, he would be moved to the execution chamber. Soon, the four would be inserted. Soon, the drug would flow into his veins. But before that happened, something important would be revealed. Something that would make everyone question what they thought they knew about this entire case. January 31st, 2025. The final day. Marion Bowman Jr. woke up knowing he had less than 12 hours to live. The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. Throughout the day, he remained calm. Guards said he was peaceful, quiet, ready. At some point during those final hours, Marion's attorney Boyd Young received the final statement. He read through it, preparing to deliver Marion's last words to the world. What was in that statement? What did Marion want people to know? The clock kept ticking. 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 5 p.m. Each hour brought Marion closer to the execution chamber. Outside the prison, the crowd grew larger. News cameras were everywhere. Reporters waited for information. Protesters chanted. Some prayed. Others argued. Kandee Martin's family waited too, ready to witness justice for their daughter after 24 long years. Inside, preparations continued. The execution team checked everything. The gurney where Marion would lie. The 4 lines. The pentobarbital drug. They couldn't afford another mistake like what happened with Richard Moore. At 6 p.m., Marion was brought into the execution chamber. It was a small room with white walls. In the center sat the gurney with straps to hold him down. Witnesses sat behind glass windows, watching everything. Marion was a big man, 389 pounds. The execution team worked to find a vein for the 4. Would they have trouble like everyone feared? The minutes ticked by slowly. Finally, they got the 4 in place. Everything was ready. Marion lay on the gurney, strapped down. This was it. These were his final moments on earth. But he had already decided not to speak. His attorney Boyd Young would read his final statement after the execution was over. The warden gave the signal. At 6:27 p.m., the pentobarbital began flowing into Marion's veins. The drug that would end his life. The drug that had failed with Richard Moore just 2 months earlier. Would it work this time? Would Marion suffer? The witnesses watched in silence. Some with tears, some with anger, some with relief. Everyone had different feelings about what they were seeing. Marion's breathing slowed. His eyes closed. Within minutes, he was gone. Marion Bowman Jr., 63 years old, was pronounced dead at 6:27 p.m. The first execution in America in 2025. It was over. Or was it? After Marion's death, Boyd Young stepped forward to read the final statement. Everyone listened carefully. These were the last words Marion wanted the world to hear. What would he say? The statement was short but powerful. Marion continued to maintain his innocence. He said he was being executed for a crime he didn't commit. He talked about the problems with his case, the witnesses who lied to save themselves, the lawyer who didn't fight hard enough for him, the evidence that was never properly examined. But he also said something else, something that showed who Marion was as a person, even facing death. He expressed sorrow for Kandee Martin's family. He said he understood their pain. He knew they had lost someone they loved. Even though he claimed he didn't kill her, he felt sadness for their loss. Think about that. A man about to die, still saying he's innocent, but taking time to acknowledge the victim's family. What does that tell us about him? The statement ended with hope. Marion talked about his faith. He said he was ready to meet his maker. He believed God knew the truth, even if the courts didn't. Boyd Young finished reading. The room was silent. People processing what they had just heard. An execution and a final claim of innocence. A man dead, still saying he was wrongly convicted. Marion's execution raised so many questions that still don't have clear answers. First, there's the question of guilt. Was Marion truly innocent like he claimed? Or was he guilty and just never admitted it? We have witnesses who testified against him, but those witnesses got deals to reduce their own criminal charges. How much can we trust them? James Gadsden, the cousin who testified, said Marion confessed to him. But did that really happen? Or did James make it up to save himself from prison? We'll never know for sure because Marion is gone. He can't defend himself anymore. Then there's the evidence question. Marion's legal team said prosecutors hid evidence that could have helped his case. What was that evidence? Could it have proven he didn't kill Kandee? The court said it didn't matter enough to stop the execution. But what if they were wrong? The lawyer question bothers a lot of people too. Norbert Cummings later joined a white supremacist group. Did his racial bias affect how he defended Marion back in 2002? Did Marion get a fair trial with a lawyer who might not have cared about saving a black man's life? These are serious questions without good answers. Drop a comment below and let us know. When there are this many questions about a case, should executions move forward? Hit subscribe to stay with us for the final chapter of this story. And what about the execution itself? The pentobarbital worked this time, unlike with Richard Moore. But the concerns about Marion's weight and finding a vein were real. Should executions go forward when there are medical concerns about suffering? In all of this, we can't forget the person at the center, Kandee Martin. She was only 21 years old when she died. She had dreams, plans, a future. Someone took all of that away from her on February 16, 2001. Her family suffered for 24 years. They had to wait nearly a quarter century for what they believed was justice. They attended hearing after hearing, appeal after appeal, court date after court date, watching Marion try to stop his execution over and over again. For them, Marion's death brought closure. Finally, the man they believed killed their daughter was gone. Finally, Kandee could rest in peace. Finally, justice was served. But what if Marion was telling the truth? What if he really didn't kill Kandee? Then her real killer is still out there, never caught, never punished. And an innocent man just died for a crime he didn't commit. That's the horrible truth about cases with this many questions. If Marion was guilty, then justice was served, but it took way too long. If Marion was innocent, then justice failed completely. We executed an innocent man while the real killer walked free. Either way, something is deeply wrong. Marion's execution didn't happen in isolation. It was part of South Carolina's return to the death penalty after 13 years. 3 executions in just a few months. The state was making up for lost time. But across America, the death penalty is becoming less common. Many states have abolished it completely. Others haven't executed anyone in years. There's a growing movement of people who believe the death penalty is wrong, no matter what crime someone committed. They point to cases like Marion's. Cases where there are doubts. Cases where the evidence isn't perfect. Cases where witnesses might have lied. Cases where lawyers didn't do their jobs properly. They say when even one innocent person might be executed, the whole system is broken. Others disagree. They believe some crimes are so terrible that death is the only appropriate punishment. They think about victims like Kandee Martin, young lives cut short by violence. They want justice for those victims, even if it takes decades. South Carolina sided with the second group. Marion's execution went forward despite all the questions, despite all the doubts, despite his claims of innocence. The state said justice was served. But many people walked away from that execution chamber on January 31st feeling troubled, feeling like something wasn't quite right, feeling like maybe, just maybe, they had witnessed something terribly wrong. In the final chapter, we'll explore what Marion's case means for the future of the death penalty, hear from those who knew him, and try to answer the ultimate question. Did South Carolina execute a guilty man or an innocent one? Who was Marion Bowman Jr. really? Not the man described in court documents or news articles, but the actual human being? During his 23 years on death row, Marion changed. Prison does that to people. Some become harder, angrier, more violent. But Marion went a different direction. He became a writer, a poet, a thinker. His poetry revealed a man who thought deeply about life, death, justice, and hope. While I Breathe I Hope wasn't just a poem title. It became his philosophy. Even in the darkest place imaginable, waiting to die, he chose hope over despair. Guards who worked on death row said Marion was peaceful. He didn't cause trouble. He wasn't violent. He spent his time reading, writing, and thinking. This doesn't prove innocence, of course, but it shows a side of him that the prosecution never talked about. People who supported Marion described him as intelligent and kind. They said he cared about other inmates. He encouraged them. He shared his writings. He became a positive force in a place filled with darkness. But Kandee Martin's family saw things differently. To them, Marion was the man who took their daughter away. No amount of poetry or good behavior could change that. They believed he was a killer who got exactly what he deserved, even if it took 24 years. Both views existed at the same time. Marion the poet, Marion the killer, Marion the innocent man, Marion the guilty one. Which was true? Maybe parts of all of them were true. People are complicated. Marion's case isn't unique. Across America, there have been many death row inmates who claimed innocence. Some were later proven right through DNA evidence or other discoveries. They were released after years or even decades in prison. Innocent people, almost executed. How many innocent people have actually been executed? We don't know. Once someone is dead, there's less motivation to investigate further. The case is closed. Justice is supposedly served. Moving on. But some organizations keep investigating even after executions. They found troubling patterns. Cases where the evidence was weak. Cases where witnesses lied. Cases where lawyers failed their clients. Cases where prosecutors hid important information. Marion's case had many of these red flags. Witnesses with deals. A lawyer with bias problems. Claims of hidden evidence. But the courts decided it wasn't enough to stop the execution. Here's what makes this so difficult. We can never have 100% certainty in most criminal cases. We weren't there when the crime happened. We rely on evidence and witnesses. But evidence can be misinterpreted. Witnesses can lie or be mistaken. Lawyers can fail. Judges can make errors. So how certain should we be before we execute someone? If there's a 1% chance they're innocent? 5%? 10%? Where's the line? These are questions our society still hasn't answered. One of the most frustrating parts of Marion's case is what we don't know. His legal team claimed prosecutors hid evidence. But we don't know exactly what that evidence was or how it might have changed things. There might have been other suspects the police didn't investigate thoroughly. There might have been witnesses who could have supported Marion's story but were never called. There might have been problems with how evidence was collected or analyzed. We'll never know now. Marion is gone. The case is closed. The files will gather dust in storage somewhere. Unless someone decides to dig deeper, those questions will remain unanswered forever. This is one of the strongest arguments against the death penalty. Once you execute someone, you can't undo it. If new evidence comes out later proving innocence, it's too late. With life imprisonment, at least there's a chance to fix mistakes. With execution, mistakes are permanent. Before we wrap up this investigation, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment with your final thoughts on this case. Was justice served, or did something go terribly wrong? Marion's execution was part of a bigger story. South Carolina stopped executing people for 13 years, from 2011 to 2024. Why the long pause? The state had trouble getting lethal injection drugs. Drug companies didn't want their products used for executions. They put restrictions on sales. South Carolina ran out of drugs and couldn't get more. So the state passed new laws allowing different execution methods. They brought back the electric chair as an option. They found new sources for lethal injection drugs. In September 2024, they resumed executions. 3 men were executed in just a few months. First Freddie Owens in September. Then Richard Moore in November, the one where the drugs didn't work properly the first time. Then Marion in January 2025. This rapid pace worried many people. After 13 years of no executions, suddenly 3 in a few months? Were they rushing? Were they being careful enough? Were they making sure these men truly deserved to die? The state said yes. They said these men had exhausted all their appeals. The courts had reviewed their cases multiple times. Justice delayed is justice denied. It was time. But critics said the 13-year pause should have been used to examine whether the death penalty should exist at all. They said South Carolina was clinging to an outdated, flawed system instead of joining the growing number of states moving away from executions. Here's the truth. We can't give you a neat, satisfying ending to this story. We can't tell you for certain whether Marion Bowman Jr. was guilty or innocent. The evidence points in different directions depending on how you look at it. If you believe the witnesses, especially James Gadsden, then Marion was guilty. He killed Kandee Martin, and after 24 years, justice was finally served. If you doubt those witnesses, if you think they lied to save themselves, if you believe the lawyer didn't defend Marion properly, if you think evidence was hidden, then Marion might have been innocent. An innocent man was executed while the real killer was never found. Both scenarios are possible. Both are haunting in different ways. What we do know for certain, Kandee Martin, a 21-year-old woman, was murdered in 2001. Marion Bowman Jr. was convicted of her murder based largely on testimony from witnesses who received deals. Marion spent 23 years on death row maintaining his innocence. His trial lawyer later joined a white supremacist group. The courts found the problems with his case weren't serious enough to stop the execution. Marion was executed on January 31, 2025. He died still claiming he was innocent. Marion's case forces us to ask hard questions about our justice system. Questions without easy answers. How much evidence is enough to execute someone? What do we do when witnesses might be lying to save themselves? What happens when lawyers fail their clients? Should we execute people when there are serious doubts about their guilt? Different people will answer these questions differently. That's okay. These are complicated issues that deserve serious thought and honest disagreement. But here's what everyone should agree on. If we're going to have the death penalty, we need to be absolutely certain we're getting it right. We need to make sure innocent people aren't executed. We need to make sure the system is fair. We need to make sure everyone gets a good lawyer and a fair trial. Did Marion get that? You've heard the evidence. You've heard the doubts. You've heard both sides. What do you think? On February 16, 2001, Kandee Martin was murdered. Someone shot her twice and burned her body in the trunk of her car. That's a fact. On January 31st, 2025, Marion Bowman Jr. was executed for that murder. That's also a fact. But the question between those two facts, the question that matters most, remains unanswered. Did the right person pay for Kandee's death? Marion said no until his final breath. The court said yes. Kandee's family said yes. Marion's supporters said no. The evidence is complicated and contradictory. We may never know the complete truth. That's the hardest part of cases like this. Sometimes there's no clear answer. Sometimes justice is messy and uncertain. Sometimes we have to live with doubt. What we can do is learn from cases like Marion's. We can demand better investigations, better lawyers, more careful trials, more thorough appeals. We can make sure that if we're going to execute people, we do everything possible to get it right. Because once it's done, it can never be undone. Marion Bowman Jr. is gone. Kandee Martin is gone. But the questions their case raised will remain long after both of them are forgotten. Questions about justice, truth, certainty, and what it means to take a life in the name of the law. These are questions we all need to think about. Because this isn't just Marion's story. It's our story. It's about the kind of society we want to be. Thank you for watching this investigation. Remember to subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and keep asking hard questions. The truth matters, even when it's difficult to find.